Yeah, Namaste. Sri Shashikant Anantachariji, today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Gitesh Nirban, co-convener of the webinar, distinguished invitees, dear friends who are interested in Mahabharata scholarship that have joined us. Though it is a repetition, I feel it's necessary to talk about the project a little for the sake of the speaker and also for the sake of the new audience that join us every time. I welcome you all to the 34th session of this series of webinars on Mahabharata as hosted by Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi and Kamala Nehru College, University of Delhi. These webinars are being organized under the aegis of SPARK project, which is a scheme for promotion of academic and research collaboration, an initiative of Ministry of Education, Government of India. The title of the project is Yoga Consciousness in Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita, an ethical value for societal and political well-being. We are working as a team along with Professor Vishwa Adluri of Hunter College, City University of New York, who is the international principal investigator, and Dr. Joydeep Bachi from Germany, who is presently associated with Hindu University of America, who is the co-principal investigator of the project from the international side, and Dr. Gitesh Nirban, who is hosting this webinar now from Department of Philosophy, Kamala Nehru College, who is the co-principal investigator from Indian side. And I am Professor Bala, head of the Department of Philosophy as the Indian principal investigator. We have an extended team of young scholars who are supporting us in this endeavor. Ms. Jayashree Jha, Ms. Anmol Preet Kaur, Ms. Megha Kapoor. These three are research scholars from the Department of Philosophy who are working on various aspects of Mahabharata for their doctoral program. We also have Ms. Deepshika, who is an undergraduate student supporting us in the endeavor that we have taken up. As far as our project is concerned, it is our collaborative attempt to revisit the Indian epic to explore yoga consciousness as one of its underlying messages while understanding how dharma as a result of yoga consciousness in Mahabharata can well be interpreted for political and societal well-being. This project is a journey through the roadmap of yoga consciousness to delve deeper into ancient Indian wisdom for reviving the concepts of social responsibility and value embeddedness. It is also a search for answers to the question of right action, thus portraying how yoga consciousness in the form of equanimity and equality in Mahabharata emerges as an ethical ideal. So in this project, we aim to build a new approach to yoga and also work on reappropriating the classical texts of Hinduism and also talk about or find out what is the right course of action at the societal and political levels that we can draw from the text Mahabharata. And also we look to explicate the universal philanthropic and humanitarian aspects of Hinduism which are available in the text Mahabharata. So our attempt is not just to explore various aspects of Mahabharata from the academic perspective, but our attempt is also to reach out to a diverse audience who are interested in Mahabharata scholarship. We started this series of webinar during the extreme phase of lockdown to engage minds with Mahabharata. It's almost like 1 year that we would be completing very soon, and we have completed. This is the 34th webinar that we are hosting today, and our aim is to complete 50 lectures on Mahabharata by various distinguished scholars and people who are actively engaged with the text and tradition. We have had the privilege of hosting scholars of repute from universities, organizations in India and abroad, wherein diverse topics related to Mahabharata and Bhagavad Gita have been touched, ranging from social and political well-being, ethical dilemmas, justice, consciousness, karma yoga, instrumental violence, ethical dilemmas, humanness in punishment, environmental influences, dialogical consciousness, and place of curses and boons in the text. Many more topics pertaining to the epic all as an attempt to explore Mahabharata for the human well-being. We are very honored to have with us today Mr. Shashikant Anantachari, a cinematographer. He will be speaking to us on Mahabharata traditions of Tamil Nadu, textures of memory and textures of time. It is, in fact, I must mention this. We haven't had a cinematographer or somebody who is a part of the creating of narrative through audiovisual means with us so far in these 33 webinars that we have hosted. We have largely limited to only academia, but we felt that there is a dire need to go beyond this limitation of confining to academia and listen to the other contributors to the development of or contributions to Mahabharata scholarship and Mahabharata tradition as such. So with that intention, we thought it would be very interesting and wonderful to listen to a person who is into audio-visual mode and who contributes actively to narrative, no? Because cinematography is a narrative, and this narrative has larger influence than a book, a narrative in a book. So that's how it would be very interesting to listen to a speaker who is from cinematography. Friends, as we look at Mahabharata, we always repeat this saying that Mahabharata is an epic, but it is not just an epic in the form of a text. It is also a tradition. So when we say tradition, we understand that it has varied aspects along with being a written one. It is also in the oral tradition. It is also a performing one. It is a part of the consciousness of the people of India, where it comes out in the everyday life as well. No, that is how it is transmitted form of belief system or knowledge system from generation to generation, and that is how we call it a tradition. And it is not that there is only one tradition that is existent of Mahabharata in India. Every state, every region has its own variedness, differences. Depending on, it is not to reject the other traditions, but it is only to ascertain and affiliate oneself more to their own native and regional understandings and aspirations of the epistemology of the individuals. And that is where you would find slight divergences and more stresses on certain aspects when you map the Mahabharata traditions that we find around the country. And in this regard, I think the memory and time, these two are very important in development of the history, in understanding the history. And if you carefully map these textures of memory and time, you would be able to understand history in a better way, not as a uniform mode of or linear kind of one, rather as a diverse and divergent kind of one. And that is how it would be very interesting looking at this title, like Mahabharata Traditions of Tamil Nadu, Textures of Memory and Textures of Time. So I'm hoping that we are really going to have a wonderful feast through Shashikant Anantacharya. I really look forward to this talk. And with this, I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Geetesh so that she can formally introduce Shashikant ji to all of us. Over to you, Dr. Geetesh.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Namaskar and welcome to you all to the 34th lecture in the ongoing series of Spark webinars. We welcome our esteemed guest of the day, Shri Shashikant Anantachari ji. He's an alumni from cinema from FTII Pune and has worked as a cinematographer, shooting art house feature films and documentaries at Calcutta. He has shot more than 300 documentaries and about 6 feature films. His noted work, as we all need to know, are Kal Abhi Rati, that is Time Addiction in Bengali. The director has been Amitabh Chakrabarti. It received the Golden Peacock for the Best Experimental Film National Awards in 1991. Yugant, again in Bengali, directed by Aparna Sen. It too received the Golden Peacock for the Best Bengali Film National Awards in 1995. Wali, The Open, an experimental documentary on the river Kaveri in 1997, directed by Mr. Bala Kailasham and Sri Shashikantji. It was officially selected at the Blow Up Chicago Art House International Film Festival in 2016. Kelai Draupadai, Listen Draupadi is Sri Ananthachariji's first independent work as a producer, director, cinematographer, which is a documentary on the Mahabharata traditions of Tamil Nadu. It received the Best Foreign Film at DIY Film Festival, Los Angeles, 2016. It was also the official selection at the Blow Up Chicago Art House International Film Festival, 2016. He's currently working on the completion of my trilogy of films, starting with Kelai Draupadi on the Indian epic narrative traditions. The second part is titled Ninayavin Nagaram, that is landscape and memory, on the aesthetics and history of this tradition. And the third is named Kalpavasi, that is Textures of Time, which has been shot at the Kumbh Mela at Ujjain in 2016. Now, these films with his book Mahabharat of the Mind comprise the epic narrative traditions project, which he has been working for the past 10 years. We are very privileged to have him amongst us as the first cinematographer speaker in the webinar series of Spark, as Dr. Bala just mentioned. Today, he's presenting an excerpt from his forthcoming book, Mahabharat of the Mind, a paper titled Mahabharat Traditions in Tamil Nadu, Textures of Memory, Textures of Time. We welcome you, Shashikantji, and now I hand over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to begin with a statement from Yoga Vasistha. It says that the world is like the impression left by the telling of a story. This is the story of the Mahabharata, which I will narrate right now. There were 300 villages, and for over 1,000 years, an elaborate Mahabharata theatre
voice is very low.
has been performed in Tamil Nadu.
There is a sound problem.
This
Shashikantji.
festival, surprisingly, is a living tradition. The festival once might have had state patronage, but currently it's still a vibrant celebration, functioning without any institutional, religious, corporate, or state support.
Shashikantji, there is a sound issue. You will have to increase the volume.
Your voice is very low. Can you check the settings and increase the volume there? Or
Where is the settings?
louder so that we can hear you properly.
No, where is the settings? Where is the volume?
The volume would be on your machine, on your laptop. It's a setting in the, I think the mic or something?
Oh, my mic setting is okay.
Basically, your voice is very low, so probably you can speak louder. That also sometimes resolves some of the problems. Be louder so that.
Yeah, is it now? Is it clearer?
Yes.
Is it okay? Yeah, I think I'll put the thing closer, but I'm not seeing any option for a mic. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
better.
Yeah, I'll speak at this volume. Okay. In over 300 villages and for over 1,000 years, an elaborate Mahabharata theatre festival has been performed in Tamil Nadu and southern Andhra Pradesh. This festival, surprisingly, is still a living tradition. The festival once might have had state patronage, but currently it is still a vibrant tradition, purely financed by individual contributions from each family in the village. It can be easily one of the oldest independent theatre festivals currently in the world right now. And its primary objective seems to create inclusive communities of belonging. This elaborate theatre festival is celebrated purely at the behest of the villagers. If in a village a Mahabharata festival has not been performed for 2 to 3 years. One enthusiastic villager will climb the flagpole outside the Dharmaraja, the Draupadi Amman temple, and hoist a flag. This the villagers call a false flag. Once a false flag is hoisted, pressure will mount on the village elders to hold a festival that year. The village elders will be forced to convene a meeting and they will decide whether their village has the money to organize such a huge festival. Once they decide to hold a festival, the second flag is hoisted. This is called the Vyasa flag or the Vyasa Kodi, which has an emblem of Vyasa, the original writer of the Mahabharata, on it. So this is indicated to the neighboring villages that this village is going to hold a Mahabharata festival that year. Once the entire proceedings, it takes about 3 to 4 months to organize this elaborate festival. And once the money is collected, and then once the Vyasa flag is hoisted, each family contributes whatever they can to conduct the festival. Then the third flag is hoisted, and which is called the Hanuman flag. This is an indication that the festival has begun. So these 3 flags are also an important marker to the neighboring villages who would also be curious to attend the festival of this village. So though the money which is collected is called a seed money, which will usually be about 2 to 3 lakhs. But the actual money spent in the festival will be much more. It can be as each jati, each community in the village will take the sponsorship of one particular ritual or one particular day. And when you say sponsorship, which means feeding all the people who come to the attend the festival. So it as Raja Mudaliar, one of the treasurers of the Arcot festival, said, they collected it. Arcot festival is the biggest festival, Mahabharata festival in Tamil Nadu, which goes for about 100 days. So as a seed money, they collected 7 lakhs from the villagers. But the actual expenditure on the festival, he says, went to 1.5 crores. Because each jati will sponsor one ritual, which, what do you say, celebrates their identity marker. And there is healthy competition between each of these jatis, communities, to make their celebrations the grandest. So this healthy competition also makes the entire festival grander. So every year you can see it, what do you say, becoming bigger and bigger. In 2013, when Raja was a treasurer, he said the temple collected seed money of 7 lakhs. Each caste or community then undertook the expense of the day of the festival, which celebrated the caste or community identity. And this is another curious fact. The festival, what you say, celebrates caste and community identity, but it also transcends it. This is another curious facet of the festival. This decentralized funding is another reason why the tradition has survived so long. Not only does the competition between the various jatis ensure that sufficient sums are raised, it also allows for each villager to be an equal custodian of this ancient tradition. Interesting, the festival also becomes an opportunity for each region and community to showcase its skills. Subram Chettiar, another organizer of the Arcot festival, quoted an ancient saying. He said, Arcot Aravan, Manamati Tapasu, and Uttarameru Paduvalam. It means that Arcot is famous for the huge Aravan statues they built for the festival. Manamati, a town of silk weavers, is famous for the silk ladders they weave for this ritual called Arjula's penance. And Uttarameru, which has a huge potter community, is famous for the huge, what do you say, Duryodhana sculptures they sculpt for the Penultimate-based ritual. People walk from miles around to see these unique artifacts. Though the overall structure of the festival remains the same across all the regions, each region, because of its caste, community, and occupational demographics, to inscribe itself in the festival, it adds its own value to differentiate itself from the rest. That's why the festival celebrates a Mahabharata. Each village simultaneously celebrates itself as well. So each festival, though it's same as the other festivals in 299 villages, is unique it is a festival of that particular village, and that is very religiously maintained. The duration of these Mahabharata festivals can stretch from 10 to 100 days, depending upon the economics of each village. And on first sight, it looks like an unstructured, chaotic celebration. On closer look, a latent structure emerges. The festival, as they celebrate it now, has three components. In the mornings, episodes of the Mahabharata are performed as village rituals. In the afternoon, a singer and a storyteller sing Viluputra's 14th century Mahabharata called Nallan Pillai, 14th century rendition of the Mahabharata, and an elaboration of the same text called Nallan Pillai Bharatam. The singer would first sing verses from these traditions, with the storyteller translating the high poetic Tamil rendition of the epic in contemporary Tamil. And right through the night, episodes of the epic will be performed as theatre in the traditional Tirukuttu form, which in its stylistics has an unofficial connection to other village theatre traditions in South and Southeast Asia. The epics Ramayana and the Mahabharata have multiple resonances and emotional registers to its audience, from the spiritual to the banality of everyday life. While they are at core discourse on ethics, they have also been the vehicles for the preservation and transmission of the collective memory of the people. The Mahabharata and its performance traditions in Tamil Nadu has another layer superimposed on it, and it is seen as an anti-war text. One common refrain as to why the festival was performed through an identical response from the participants. They said it was to promote Samarism or peace or harmony. This is one important facet of the festival, where a narrative of a fratricidal war between cousins, in which nobody really wins, becomes a vehicle to build communities of belonging. I can only speculate a few reasons for this. A series of cataclysmic wars which were fought between the Pallavas and the Chalukyas during the 7th to the 10th century seem to be the oldest memory of this region. A pop-up and is inscribed in the double Mahabharata performance traditions of this region. A copper plate inscription found in a village called Puram near Kanchipuram records a grant given by the Pallava king Parameshwaravarman to recite the Bharatam, that is the Mahabharata, dating the Mahabharata tradition of Tamil Nadu to the times of the Pallavas. It is the Pallavas who seem to have popularized the epic, as they commissioned poets like Bharavi to write epic poems like Kiratarjunyam with themes from the Mahabharata. Themes from the Mahabharata have also been sculpted for the first time in this region in the monuments commissioned by them, like the sculptures of Mamalapuram. Four cities are connected intrinsically with this Mahabharata tradition. Kanchipuram, the capital of the Pallavas; Senji, the place where Draupadi was born out of fire to kill a demon called Kochakan; Badami, the capital of the invading Chalukya armies, which in the narratives of this region is remembered as a demon, Patapi; and finally Mamalapuram, which was a monument commissioned by the Pallavas to commemorate their victory over the Chalukyas. What is interesting is to see how this memory is inscribed both in the royal perception and in the people's perception. In Mamalapuram, the poet Dandi tangentially records the first of the narratives in his prose work, Avanti Sundarikatha. Dandi was a poet from Kanchipuram who, according to his own account, migrated to Ujjain when Kanchipuram was besieged by the Chalukyas. When Narasimhavarman wrested Kanchipuram back from the Chalukyas, Dandi returned to Kanchipuram, and on his return, the first person he visits is first place he visits is Mamalapuram to meet the master sculptor Lalitalaya, who is at the time of Dandi's visit working on the earliest monument of Mamalapuram, establishing when and why Mamalapuram was commissioned. The royal narrative of Mamalapuram records the commissioning of Mamalapuram in the following story. Once the globe poor Brahmin called Pundarika wanted to visit Vishnu in his residence on the Milky Ocean and reach Mamalapuram. Cross the 7 seas to reach Vishnu. In a pond in Mamalapuram, he saw a lovely lotus he thought would be the apt gift to his deity. As he stepped foot in the pond, a crocodile gripped him by his legs, and all that Pundarika could do was to pray to his deity to save him. When the crocodile heard the prayer, it transformed into King Mahendravarman, who recounts his narrative to Pundarika. He says he was a king who was cursed to being crocodile due to his own vanity. He says that once he was taken to the land of the gods and was amazed by the amazing sculptures there and wanted to rival that in his own kingdom. Due to this extraordinary obsession in sculpture, he neglected his important duties as a king, which were of feeding and protecting his people. He tells Pundarika to beat his son Narasimhavarman and tell him that the curse on him, that is Mahendravarman, was redeemed by his son Narasimhavarman, and he has returned to his normal form again. This again, bemused Pundarika goes towards the sea, wondering how he was going to cross the ocean. When an old man approaches him and says that he can dry up the oceans by emptying it with his water vessel. But first he wants Pundarika to cook some food for him, as he is very angry. Pundarika did not believe the old man could drive out the ocean, but remembered what Mahendravarman was cursed because he neglected to feed his people. So he goes to cook food for the old man. When he returned, he is surprised to find the old man missing. But in the idol of Varaha, the wild boar incarnation of Vishnu, the protector of the earth, where he had left the old man. Pundarika realizes that the old man must have been Vishnu and realizes that he need not travel the 7 seas to meet him, as it already seen him. But he is surprised by the iconography of Varaha's form. All Varaha idols look east towards the direction of the sea from where Varaha has to the earth, but the Varaha Mamalapuram looks west. So Pundarika asks him as to why he is looking in the opposite direction. When Varaha replies that he'll be shortly installed in Kanchipuram, which is the direction he was looking at. To re-stress this narrative, it is repeated 2 more times with 2 other people, Narada and Agastya, visiting Mamalapuram and asking Varaha the same question, which he gives the same reply. This story is a cryptic reference to the defeat of Mahendravarman by the Chalukyas. It seems it took Narasimhavarman 14 years to recruit, build an army, and wrest Kanchipuram back from the Chalukyas. This narrative is linked directly to the west-facing Shore temple in Mamalapuram. Dan records that all temples built to commemorate victory in battle were usually west-facing, and temples which were built to celebrate prosperity of times were all east-facing. And the temple being alluded here is the Shore temple at Mamalapuram, which is west-facing. The narrative of Mahendravarman being cursed into a crocodile for failing his duty to people has allusions to the narrative of Gajendra Moksham, where a devout king is cursed to being born as an elephant as he failed his duty of being a good horse. His curse is redeemed when a crocodile grabs his leg and the elephant Gajendra Bahu appeals to Vishnu for help. The narrative of Gajendra Moksham is one of the framing narratives of Mamalapuram, and to re-stress its importance, there are 3 depictions of Gajendra Moksham at Mamalapuram. I'll speak fast later as to why narratives are repeated twice in this edition. There are 3, what do you say, Mahishasura Matris, there are 3 Arjuna Tapas. Everything is done twice in Mamalapuram. Next narrative links Kanchipuram with Senji. Significantly, another Varaha, another white boar, starts the narrative of Senji, re-stressing the intertextuality of the Remba memories. Once a wild boar was running amok in the temple gardens of Vararaja Perumal temple at Kanchipuram. Numerous soldiers tried to either capture or kill the wild boar, but all of them failed. Finally, the king himself ventured to kill the boar. The king is variously named as a Pallava king, a Chola king, and a Vijayanagara king, but in different versions of the same narrative. And except for the difference in the name of the king, the core narrative remains the same. The boar, when confronted with the king, ran to the king in hot pursuit. Finally, the boar halted its run at Finji and showed its true form to the king. It was actually Vishnu in his man-lion avatar as Narasimha. The deity instructed the king to build a temple to itself, which the king promptly did. The fourth city was said to have built after the building of this temple to Narasimha. Narasimha in this narrative might be an overt allusion to Narasimhavarma, who regained Kanjipuram, and Mamalapuram, the temples commissioned by Narasimhavarma, have his signature in the shape of have his signature in the line-shaped pillar adorning the monuments. The narrative of the second birth of Draupadi at Chanji restresses this reading. The next is a popular narrative from people's narrative from the Mahabharata picture, which links the second birth of Draupadi to the Pallava king and hence Kanjipuram and Mamalapuram. Once when King Sritan, the great grand descendant of Arjuna, was ruling Hastinapura, his kingdom was terrorized by a demon called Rochakan. This Rochakan was none other than the descendant of Bakasura, who had been killed by Bhima during the exile of the Pandavas. Bakasura is the first demon of outside killed by the Pandavas in the exile. And the killing of Bakasura is an important emotional marker in the Mahabharata festivals of Tamil Nadu, and is performed as a ritual, narrated as a story, and enacted as theatre. The killing of Baka evokes the idea that this troubled Draupadi effectively in these rituals. In the Mahabharata, the Pandavas get married to Draupadi after this killing, and in the doubled Mahabharata, Draupadi is reborn as Rochaka, a contemporary demon who is a grand descendant of Bakasura. In the epic, Baka is terrorizing a village in which the Pandavas find asylum after escaping Duryodhana's assassins. Bhima gets angry when he hears that the village has been forced to provide a cartload of food and a human victim to the glutton Baka. As the only son of the family which sheltered them is a designated human sacrifice, Bhima offers to go instead. In the village festival for this episode, each family cooks food for Bhima to carry to Baka. Two actors dressed as Bhima and Baka travel to the village, collecting food from each household. By the act of cooking food for this ritual, each household inscribes itself into the epic, and each person becomes doubled. They are both members of the festival village as well as characters of Baka's village. Returning to the temple of Draupadi of Sanji, Rojakan now wants to avenge his ancestor Baka's killing by killing all the descendants of the Pandavas. Shinizan is told that Rochakan had received a boon making him invincible. Only a person born out of fire, that is Draupadi, could kill Rochakan. Shinizan was asked to find the two sages, Yachan and Upayachan, who had first performed the fire sacrifice, and asked them to perform the yagam so that Draupadi could be born again. Shinizan searched all the lands for the two sages and finally located them at Sanji. Draupadi was born again out of fire, and she said that she could kill Rochakan, but said that there was a problem. When the 100 heads of Rochakan, which held his life, fell on the ground, 100 more Rochakans would be born. She said only the greatest Shiva worshipper would be able to hold Rochakan's head for all of eternity, protecting the world from utter calamity. She says that only Pothuraja could do this task and asked Sritan to enlist his aid. Till today, Pothuraja stands as the guardian deity outside all Draupadi Amman temples, holding the severed 100th head of Rochakan firmly in his hands. Pothraja is the way the Pallava kings were addressed and was how they signed their royal edicts, which can be seen in the stone inscriptions of the Pallava monuments. By the inscription of the narrative of Pothraja, retelling becomes simultaneously both of the Sanskrit epic and the contemporary memory of the people and the collective memory of the people. So when people hear and see the Mahabharata, they also hear, see, and remember themselves. And the epic does not remain a narrative of a war fought elsewhere, but becomes a recounting of the wars of the region as well. This is another interesting addition which this tradition of Mahabharata of Tamil Nadu adds to this the epic. The inscription of Pothraja into the epic as the guardian deity of Draupadi, other guardian deities appear, all of whom represent the images of various wars and invasions the region had experienced. Draupadi is seen in these narratives as a representative of the people with the power to negotiate autonomy to the village public. These memories of war are not historic memories. Rather, they are generic and are neither a lament nor a dirge. They firmly celebrate the resilience of the people and assert their will to live even under the most desperate of times. Three ideas are crucial in engaging with what can be called the Indian way of engaging with the world, and this can be seen explicitly in the ascetic traditions. The first is the idea that the world or living in it is dukkha or sorrow. Forgetfulness is seen as one reason for this sorrow, and retrieval of memory becomes necessary to address this sorrow. And third idea which runs through is the importance of vanavasana, or living in the forest. Vanavas is usually translated in English as exile, but there's a problem here. The English word exile has intrinsic connotation to punishment, whereas vanavas was mostly voluntary, undertaken when one felt it was time to give up the superficial trappings of life and engage in its essentials. Most ancient Indian cities were built around sacred groves, with one of their names often the name of the grove of the forest. For example, the city of Varanasi was known as Anandvan, and Ujjain was known as Mahakalvan. The city and forest were located in contiguity and were philosophically inclusive of the other. The multi-layered Mahabharata festival also puts Vanavas at its core. For the duration of the festival, entire villages live in the forest of mind, away from their own homes, away from their own homes, listen to the stories of the Mahabharata that the Pandavas heard in their own exile. Saying oft repeated in these performances is that to be a good king or even a good human being, one first has to abandon one's zones of security and comfort. One has to venture into the forest both within and outside oneself and kill the demons both within and outside oneself. Only then a true return is possible. Again, the epics Ramayana and Mahabharata resist closure, and it is said that there are 15 layers of meaning overlaid in these epics. Each listener will be listening to the epics from a perspective derived from their own lived experience of being the world. When a seeker, again due to her or his power or inner disposition, notices a new layer of meaning, she or he would reach out to a teacher to get a perspective on what it probably meant. If she or he feels that the answer does not resolve the question posed, the seeker would approach another teacher and the open-ended request would continue. The practice of yoga and the yoga tradition is one layer framing the ethics. The Ramayana, according to traditions of yoga, represents the solar spiritual journey of an ideal human consciousness, while the Mahabharata is a lunar mental journey of consciousness. Here I would like to play, Jeshiji, if you can play Draupadi singing the Ramayana.
Sure, sir.
Okay. Jeshiji, are you there?
Yeah, sure, sir. I'll do that.
Jeshiji, are you there?
Yes, sir, I'm doing it.
Yeah, this particular song which is going to play is called a Pudu Padal or a common song. This song is sung in various courses when the actors are preparing for their next scene. Yeah, this is called a Podu Padal. This song can be sung anywhere. But what is interesting is right through the festival, Draupadi's address as a festival of Rama, and this is why I played this song. The Mahabharata festivals of South India, the idea of the path of the Pandavas' journey is also alluded as a path of yoga. This is not foregrounded as a metaphor or an allegory, but it's just another way of perspective to engage the epic. And now repeated line in all traditions of Ramayana is that Rama is Satya, Lakshmana is a steadfast, unwavering mind, Hanuman is a lifeless prana, and Sita is a manifest of the Kundalini Shakti of Rama, which he has released. Lanka is a Muladhara Chakra and center of both of itself and the world, and Rama present within himself to free his Muladhara Chakra, his own center. Ravana of 10 heads is unrestrained ego with 5 organs of perception and 5 organs of action. He is a representation of all that has to be vanquished for Rama to be able to return from his Vanavasa. And in terms of iconography, this image of Rama, Sita, Lakshmana, and Hanuman is a quintessential depiction of Ramayana and is a lasting image of Ramayana in the popular domain. This is an image of spiritual alignment of and within oneself, which is the ideal to be aspired for. Another idea of yoga is presented spectacularly in the village tradition of Mahabharata. Another image of Vanavasam, living in the forest, and return is foregrounded. The Pandavas have to go through 3 periods of living in the forest. They are first born in the forest and return to claim the share of their patrimony from the cousins. The deceit of Duryodhana makes them return to the forest, which again becomes the time they do and form new alliances. The third stay in the forest is after the loaded dice game, in which Yudhishthira loses everything that the Pandavas had worked hard to attain. This final Vanavasam includes 1 year of living incognito in disguise, where there has been someone, something diametrically opposite to their own inner dispositions. So Yudhishthira becomes a gambler, Bhima the glutton becomes a cook, etc. And what they return to finally is a war. It's something they have to fight both within themselves and outside of themselves. The penultimate day of the festival, in which all the elements of the performance come together of theatre, storytelling, and ritual, is seen as the most important day of the festival. And people from various villages come to the performing villages in thousands for the event. Though the festival is called by numerous names, as the Bharadam festival or Draupadi Amman Bharadakuti festival, or even simply the Mahabharata Kuti festival, in popular parlance, it's often called Padagalam, the battlefield. As this day of the festival, with the war finally ends, has tremendous orders of significance for the participants. On this day, Bhima finally kills Duryodhana, signaling the end of the war and the return of peace. The final killing of Duryodhana, the counter anti-self of Bhima, is a culmination of multiple journeys, the most important of which is the yogic journey of Pandavas of self-realization, where they finally achieve an alignment within themselves. As an elaborate Mahabharata festival that I was working on was intrinsically connected to the Pallava period, I started looking at the inscriptions and to study their iconography to engage better with this tradition in context of the times it produced it. In Kailasnatha temple at Kanchipuram, there is an inscription which offers another perspective as how narratives are inscribed in the collective memory. The inscription says that in the Krita Yuga, a bodiless voice coming from the sky had been heard by kings. Foremost among them, Dushyanta, who were familiar with the gods and accepted by Kanva and other cities. This is no wonder, but in the Kali Yuga, which is deprived of two virtues, he, the king Sridhara, that is a name for King Rajasimha, he who bears prosperity, again heard the voice. This indeed is a great surprise. This inscription refers to the image of Vishnu in his Yoga Nidra Anantadayana, where he is opened by the disembodied voice from the sky. At the end of each cycle of time, Vishnu, the protector of the world, goes into his cosmic sleep, his Yoga Nidra. All that existed, all that was created is made back into the body of Vishnu. And the world, as it were, does not exist anymore. The worlds are but the inhalation and the exhalation of the breath of Vishnu, getting born in the exhalation and perishing and returning to its source with its inhalation. Every exhalation of Vishnu, the protective world, creates a new cycle of time, a new kalpa, comprising Satyuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and finally the chaotic Kali Yuga. According to this understanding of time, we are the residents of the Kali Yuga, or the 28th exhalation of Vishnu, and the world as we know it has been created and destroyed 27 times before. Vishnu's first task after when he hears the voice is to kill these two demons. Every exhalation of the breath of Vishnu inaugurates a new epoch of time. Each new epoch is inaugurated with the birth of another Brahma, the creator of the worlds, and the custodian of the collective memory of the worlds. Brahma is born on lotus from the navel of Vishnu. Along with Brahma, two demons called Madhu and Kaisava are also born from the earwax of Vishnu. Literally, they are born of the primordials. They are born of the primordial sound. The first question to us that bother these two demons as who they were. They also wonder as to where they were. Vishnu's first task is to kill these two demons, to retrieve memory. The demons are spirited to the depths of the ocean. Another cycle of time is inaugurated. Every major dynasty of the subcontinent has rendered as a template, common template of 6 to 8 images, which are given pride of place. These are images of Anantasayana, Trivikrama, Mahishasura Mardini, Varaha, Gangadhara, Gajalakshmi, Saraswati, and Durga in the monuments commissioned by them. As Sri Bara's inscription clearly states that just as Vishnu and Bhusheta heard a voice inside, Sri Bara also heard a voice. Here there is no intention of being presumptuous and claiming the king was the earthly incarnation of the deity. Rather, it indicates a declaration of intent of each king. They have tried to emulate the deities. Like Ananta Sena, they would try to restore order in the chaotic times of Kali Yuga. Like Mahishasura, they would restore their opponents. Like Gajalakshmi, they would inaugurate a time of prosperity in the kingdom. And like Gangada, they would take care of the need of water among the people. Each successive generation of sculptors seem to have alluded to the work of the previous generation and also marked its departure. It's been an interesting exercise closely studying the same image, which has been rendered differently by sculptors of Udayagiri caves in Madhya Pradesh, Chalukya sculptors of Aihole, Badami, and Patadakkal, and the sculptors of Mamalapuram. The panels at Mamalapuram, while standing on the shoulders of preceding Sthapatis works, are unique and represent a departure from the work of their predecessors. As an opening statement, I'll say that the notion of polynarratives or of a single panel holding within itself multiple narratives represents this departure. As an image maker and artist myself, what interests me is to how the sculptors of each dynasty have rendered the same images. In Indian iconography, the subject of the depiction can be identified by either the centrality of the given to the subject, or in some cases the volume or the size of the central subject with regards to the other figures in the same panel. For over 200, Jeshiji, can you play that the other video, which is second video, which is Descent of the Ganges?
Sure, sir.
Jeshiji, are there? Yeah, this is the panel which, what do you say, where I start my other journey. For over 200 years, there has been a raging debate as to what the sculpture called the Descent of the Ganges at Mamalapuram depicted. Some are firmly of the opinion that the panel represents Bhagirath's penance, and there are solid arguments in favor of this. Others with equally solid arguments maintain that it represents Arjuna's penance, and some maintain that it's a representation of both. What is interesting to me here is that there seems to be a strong quotation of the cave panel at Udayagiri depicting Varaha rising to the seas from the seas with Bhudevi. The cave panel at Udayagiri only can be called an installation art. As during the monsoon, water would enter the cave, creating the illusion that Varaha was rising from the ocean. In the panel that Descent of the Ganges, there is a pond-like structure where water flowing down from the river to be collected. There are elaborate waterways on top of the hill to facilitate this. In the Descent of the Ganges, can you play back the images again? The Descent of the Ganges, both markers of Indian cultural traditions are simultaneously, creating multiple interrelations. In terms of volume or sheer size occupied in the panel, the beautifully carved elephants dominates the panel, and Arjuna and Bhagirath are much smaller in proportion. The river flowing down the center, marking the panel, making the panel a diptych, is another marker, and all the yakshas and the pillars depicting the panel are not looking at Arjuna or Bhagirath, but they are looking at with wonder at the three snakes rising up from the primordial water below. Any engagement with this panel has to engage with what the elephant heard and the three rising snakes represent. The practice of yoga speaks about three knots, blockages called the granthis, which have to be unloosened, overcome, for one to be aligned with oneself. These three knots are the Brahma Granthi, Vishnu Granthi, and Rudra Granthi, and the panel variously called the Descent of the Ganges at Mamalapuram depicts this understanding. One half of the panel represents the Pingala Nadi of the yoga tradition with an image of Surya given by the place. The other half is the representation of the Ida Nadi with Chandra given prominences as Surya. The river separates the two panels is the representation of Sushumna Nadi, and the three snakes ascending the river is the movement of the life breath prana moving upwards. And also three blockages, the Brahma Granthi, the Vishnu Granthi, and the Rudra Granthi, that have to be overcome in the upward movement. The double representation of either Arjuna or Shiva or Bhagirath or Shiva is but a small part of the panel, and what is actually of both ideation and emotional importance of the panel is really at the center of the panel. Again, foregrounding centrality and pride of place given to the main area that is being evoked in Indian cultural traditions. The figures and celestial figures on top of the panel function to draw on ties to what is important in the composition. They are depicted in the posture of Adbhuta or wonderment, with either their left or right hands indicating the object of wonderment. The object of wonderment is neither Arjuna or Bhagirath, nor the river itself. If the lines can be drawn from where the eyes are looking at, it will be clear they are looking at with wonder at the three rising snakes, a single-headed snake, a three-headed snake, and a seven-headed snake. A visual representation of the rising of the Kundalini. The three snakes simultaneously are also the idea of three blockages, and which have to be overcome on their path to moksha. The entire path, entire narrative is a poly narrative with the notion of moksha or liberation of different personas or school of thought represented as narrative images within the larger panel. And depending on a panel of point of entry in viewing a panel, a different narrative would be foregrounded. The narrative of Gajendra Moksham, the moksha of the Pallava king Mahendravarman, the penance of Narasimhavarman to reach its land, and the Panchatantra tale of the wily old fox, wily old cat, are some of the narratives alluded to with an exuberant sense of play in the panel. This panel in Mamalapuram is seen as representing the essence of the central narrative around which the entire temple complex of Mamalapuram is constructed. This inner doubling, which is a unique feature of this panel, is a region of play in Mamalapuram, and like the Mahabharata itself, it too seems to have been conceived as a play of mirrors. Each image is really a double image, and the double can be a counter self or anti-self that which is being more. This is from the go back to another binary, the temple complex that Mamalapuram explores is a play that has been created the idea of form and the formless, and the structure being constantly juxtaposed and framed within the non-structure. There seems to have been no attempt made to cut the rock to suit the requirement of the composition. While the play here is to work with the natural formation of the rock as a given, which now really becomes the frame in which the composition is sculpted within the confines of the natural formation of the rock, creating an illusion that the rock itself determines the composition. Near the panel Arjuna's penance, there's a massive rock mounted on the incline of the wheel. It must be a natural formation untouched by the chisel of any sculptor. But in local memory, it is seen either as Krishna's or Bhima's waterfall, and is remembered as the handful of food that Bhima was about to eat as he was called to battle. In the village festival, Bhima is seen as a glutton who, in his own personal journey, has to go over three overcomings. And these three overcomings are the men, his counter self, whom he has to kill to finally reach to become Bhima. First counter self he has to kill is his own gluttony in the form of a man eating Brahmarakshasa, Ogre Bakasura. Later, when he has to live for 1 year in disguise, the Bhima and the glutton love to choose to be his own counter self of a cook who provides food for everyone else. In this avatar, he has killed 800 later in Tamil of a great wrestler called Kishka, known for misusing his power to be known as a bully and a tyrant. The third overcoming of Bhima is celebrated as a grand enactment on the penultimate day of the Mahabharata festival. Here, Bhima finally kills the arch enemy Duryodhana. Duryodhana, consistent with this tradition of the epic, is also troubled, and who Bhima has to kill is both the Duryodhana inside and the Duryodhana outside. For this performance, a massive 100 to 150 feet recumbent statue representing Duryodhana is carved out of clay and becomes the venue of the penultimate stage event. Though Bhima and Duryodhana fight through the streets of the festival village, the participants know the actor playing Duryodhana will only be killed near the statue representing it. After Bhima and Duryodhana have fought through the streets of the village, the actor Duryodhana will enter the charm circle where his image is represented. And the actor Bhima does not kill the actor Duryodhana, but breaks the leg of the sculpture representing Duryodhana. As Peter Bettel records in his cult of Draupadi, a beautiful theatre ritual which is now very rarely performed, where the dead Duryodhana introspects and feels remorse for his own actions, which led to this massive carnage, which is what the great war was finally. The ritual, as Peter Bettel records it, is actually a denouement of the role called Duryodhana, where he is able to look at the world devoid of the rage and envy which determined engage in the world. Duryodhana in his death becomes human, and really becomes the king. JCG, can you play the Festival of Memories? This is a penultimate day's ritual, and
இப்போ இங்கே கூத்து நடந்துட்டு இருக்குல்ல, பீமனுக்கும் துரியோதனனுக்கும் கூடிய வாக்குவாதத்தில் அதை வந்து ரெஃபர் பண்ணி பேசுவான். எப்பாடுறா உன்னை பண்ணிட்டு இருக்காங்கடா, நாளைக்கு உனக்கு பலி கொடுக்க போகிறோம்டா அப்படின்லாம் சொல்லுவான். அதாவது வெரி இன்விஷனை கிரியேட் பண்ணவே இல்லை கூத்து. என்னென்னமோ அங்கேயும் இங்கேயும் முன்னாடியும் பின்னாடியும் காலத்தில் அங்கேயும் இங்கேயும் அது வந்து ஒரு பிரமாதமான ஒரு பெரிய சுதந்திரத்தில் அங்கேயும் இங்கேயும் வருது. இதை வந்து கிராமத்தில் நமக்கு வந்து ஒரு மாடர்ன் தியேட்டருக்காரனாக பார்க்குற போது இவ்வளவு அற்புதத்தை அதை வச்சிட்ருக்க அப்படின்னு தோணுதா. நீங்கள் கிராமத்தில் பார்க்குற போது உங்களுக்கு இந்த விஷயங்கள்லாம் தெரியலேன்னு வச்சுக்கோங்க, அப்போ வந்து நீங்கள் சாதாரணமாக கூட நீங்கள் நினச்சிடுவீங்க. ஆனால் இந்த விஷயங்கள்லாம் தெரிஞ்சு நீங்கள் பார்க்குற போது ஆஹா என்ன பிரமாதம் இது, அங்கே கூத்து இங்கேயே துரியோதனம் இருக்கும், அங்கே ஒரு துரியோதன சிலை கிடக்கு, அந்த சிலையை காமிச்சு இந்த துரியோதனங்கிட்ட பேசுகிறான். அப்போ வந்து நம்முடைய யுத்தத்தை இந்த பூமி தாங்காது, நாளைக்கு வந்து கார்த்த வீரிய அர்ஜுனன் சண்டை போட்ட ஒரு வெங்கல பூமி இருக்குது, அங்கே போய் நம்ம போய் சண்டை போடுவோம் அப்படின்னு சொல்லிட்டு கூத்தை முடிச்சுடுறாங்க ராத்திரியில்.
The final morning of the festival starts with an idol of Draupadi being placed where Duryodhana would be finally killed. Duryodhana knows the Sanjeevani mantra and hopes to revive his dead army to life by chanting it. Gandhari has asked the 5 remaining Kauravas, Bhishmachari on his bed of arrows, Kripachari, Kritavarman, Ashwathaman and Sanjayan to guard Duryodhana from Bhima till he finishes his invocation. The Samayam Ganachari Kumaravargam are placed around the sculpture in this ritual. They are the last 5 Kauravas alive at the end of the war. Krishna notices signs of the Kaurava army coming to life and immediately knows the reason why. He knows that if the 5 generals were guarding Duryodhana, Bhima would not be able to kill him before he finishes chanting the mantra. So Krishna decides to immobilize the 5 generals through his magic web. This is represented in the villages as 5 pieces of yellow cloth with which the Samayam Ganachari Kumaravargam are covered with.
Krishna
Bhima crosses the immobilized guards and challenges Duryodhana to fight before he finishes the mantra. They again fight through the streets of Echur before reaching the sculpted image of Duryodhana. Their fight is inconclusive, and to hasten proceedings, Krishna asks both of them to declare as to where their life breath rests. Bhima replies truthfully that his life breath rested on his forehead, while Duryodhana lies and declares that his life breath was also on his forehead. Again, they fight, chasing each other around the sculpture. Krishna, who knows where Duryodhana's weak point is, points out the thigh. When Duryodhana, the actor, reaches the thigh of the sculpture, he steps aside, and Bhima breaks the thigh of the sculpture. The actor Duryodhana falls in a trance on the sculpture and has to be carried away. The idol of Draupadi is placed on the sculpture, and the actor Draupadi smears the blood from the broken thigh on her hair and then braids it. Rangan, who is Bhishmachari and also the principal devotee of Draupadi, gets possessed and has to be calmed down. Finally, the 20-day period of vows is over for the Samayam Ganachari Kumaravargam. They are released and the sacred thread is untied from their wrists. What follows is the lament of the widows of all the men who died in the war. Originally, the widows of the village were supposed to mourn their dead along with the figure of death, Mrityu. In this village, it became more of a boisterous celebration with the young men of the village joining in fun.
One detail intrigued me this final ritual killing of Duryodhana, and that was why as to 5 men from the village down the road of the guardians of Duryodhana. Raghunath Narayan, a yoga guru, gave me an insight from yoga. The 3 overcomings of the journey of yoga is also represented in the Mahabharata as 3 periods of Vanavasa the Pandavas go through, including a year lived in disguise. Their finally necessary overcoming is the quieting of the five senses. Because these 5 sense perceptions give you the illusion that you are a distinct entity from the world around you. In the village tradition, the killing of Duryodhana is also seen as this killing of the sense of ahankara, egotism, later in everyone. the placement of the 5 figures around actually gives the ritual a double signification. And the 5 guardians of Duryodhana are both the 5 generals and the 5 senses. And what is being now killed is both the Duryodhana outside and Bhishma outside. Once the Mahabharata festival of Tamil Nadu is over, the sculpted image of Duryodhana is not destroyed, but left to nature to take its own course. Slowly the vivid colors fade, soon weeds start floating on the image. Till one day the image disappears back into the earth from which it originally came. Traveling down the countryside in Tamil Nadu, one can see numerous Duryodhanas, numerous representations of this self-delusional egotism in various stages of decay, punctuating the landscape. The festival does not end with the killing of Duryodhana and the crowning of Yudhishthira, and there are 2 more important rituals to follow. But that's a larger story. I end up my talk with this image. Killing of Duryodhana.
Thank you, Professor Bala. Thank you, Sri Shashikantji. I think Sri Shashikantji, through his presentation, took us on a virtual tour of the festival of Mahabharat, spread out for months in various geographical spaces of Tamil Nadu, explaining how the narrative tradition of the epic is conceptualized, thematized, and localized through theater, music, and other diverse art forms. This really appeared like an amazingly progressive cultural representation of the epic tradition of Mahabharat, shedding light on the textures of time and memory through the emotions of the people who were seen so involved in such an emerging and participatory display of Mahabharat. Sri Shashikantji's descriptive analysis definitely made it clear to us that research is not only the forte of the people in academia, as Professor Bala also mentioned, but also of the filmmakers, the cinematographers like Sri Shashikantji, who actually, get into the roots of the text in order to present a harmony of conceptual and theatrical aspects of the epic. And that's what he's done through his films on Mahabharat Festival in Tamil Nadu. We really look forward to reading your forthcoming book on Mahabharat of the Mind. We wish you all the best for it, and looking forward to having a copy of it in our record too. So today, on behalf of the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, Kamla Nehru College, University of Delhi, the team of scholars who are attached with this ongoing Spark project, Professor Bala Ganapathy, as well as the participants who are always with us for every webinar, and myself, I sincerely thank Sri Shashikant Anandachari ji for sparing time for us today. Wishing we all get a chance to come to Tamil Nadu to watch at least some parts of this festival sometime in the days ahead when the good times are back. That's what I think our vision has to be once, after, or let's say post-COVID situation. Thank you, participants, for being